Hello, my friends. I'm Steve Havill with Conscious Capitalism in the Bay Area chapter, and it's my honor today to have Jess Peabody, the Community Director for the International Movement, on the phone. Welcome, Jess, and thanks for being on the call with us today.
Thank you, Steve. Nice to see you.
Yeah, I'm really excited to take some time and just introduce to those that are unfamiliar with the movement or even those that have been to talk a little bit about stakeholder orientation. And it's really this big, beautiful idea that's one of the four key tenets of the movement. And I'd love to just open up the call by just asking you to just share, how would you describe stakeholder orientation and what does it mean to you,
Mm-hmm.
having been around this movement and having worked with Whole Foods as long as you have?
I say stakeholder orientation is really about holistically looking at all of the people in the community and really the environment that you are impacting when you're within business and you're operating your own businesses and really being mindful about every decision that you make is somehow going to trickle effect or have a trickle effect onto those stakeholders. So in traditional business, the concern was always about the bottom line and the shareholders. We need to deliver value to our shareholders. And stakeholder orientation is about delivering value and helping all those that you touch be healthy, be thriving, and be benefiting from the work that you're doing as a business. So it's a really neat shift in lens of considering what's important and the implications of what you do. And it is very conscious, knowing that there's not just one entity that you're trying to support and have wealth and growth benefit from.
That's awesome. Thank you for that. You know, it's cool. I know that oftentimes you and I will talk about like the stakeholder ecosystem or the solar system. That there are so many views and voices and people in the environment of our stakeholder ecosystem. It's about giving people that voice and having both feedback and feed forward systems so people feel heard, so people feel that they're part of the decisions that are made, that they're engaged, they're honored and recognized. And how have you seen that show up for you, say at Whole Foods specifically or within the conscious capitalism movement? Like, what are some of the cool expressions that you've experienced?
I think a beautiful example of this does come from my experience at Whole Foods. Whenever there were major strategic decisions being made, the company was very, very clear on taking a step back before making any decisions to really consider how each one of the stakeholder groups was going to be impacted by that decision. So for Whole Foods, there were six main stakeholder groups. There are your shareholders. That's the typical one that you're aware of as a publicly traded company. But before even thinking about the shareholders, it is thinking about how is that decision going to impact my team members, so the employees within Whole Foods Market. The next was how is this going to impact the customers? And if this decision really ends up being a trickle-down effect to raising prices significantly, that's going to impact the customer base. It's how is this going to impact the community that we serve? Again, making sure that that decision is there to support and help the community thrive, not take away from. How's that going to impact the suppliers or the vendors or the partners that the company has? And how's that going to impact the environment? So being a truly stakeholder-oriented and conscious business, you are very considerate about the environment and making green decisions and understanding carbon footprint and the tie-in there. So it's really amazing that it wasn't just, again, about the bottom line of, well, we better deliver value to our shareholders. It was, let's think about all these key components before we make the final call here and understand with that lens on how to move forward with a strategic decision. So I loved that and knew that was so at the core at major leadership decisions that were being made, that was always part of the evaluation process.
That's so cool. And by moving from this shareholder, that everything in service of the mighty dollar, where people are chewed up and spit out, it's seemingly, right? So many folks that have dealt with burnout and whatnot, myself included, from the Silicon Valley grind. It's that when it's focused on the shareholder, then people are just a resource. In fact, that's human resources, the term in the book,
Mm-hmm.
Conscious Capitalism. It talks about, hey, we're not resources, we're sources. We are infinite in our potential. And the question that I have for you is like, how did you notice how giving people a voice by engaging people in being part of the decision-making process, or at least having them have feedback into it,
Mm-hmm.
how did you see that affect the culture?
Well, it really is a sense that all ideas are important, no matter where they're coming from.
Mm,
And I'll reference Whole Foods again because I did have a long tenure there, 11 years, and also being one of the greatest examples of conscious capitalism that there is, was that some of the best ideas actually came from the team member base. So major business initiatives, like if you've ever been to a Whole Foods tap room within a
mm,
store, so they have
yes.
tap rooms now,
Beer
even
guy. Yes.
that idea actually came from a team member within a store.
Wow.
So when you build in that system where voices are truly being heard and honored and invited, then the richness of the culture and the ideas and sort of the creative solutions that come out of that, there's a wealth of those ideas. And there's a different level of buy-in where a team member on the store level, entry level, team member knows that they can actually bring this up to senior leadership and they're going to consider it. There's value in that. That also happened with a lot of the vendors and suppliers. A big piece of the relationship was that feedback feed forward, where when they're looking at initiatives to take on, whether it was a local loan producer project or a grant program, that a lot of that came out of talking with smaller local suppliers about what they needed to thrive. So it's amazing. It's this thought of we're in this together versus it's just an entity or a CEO making all the decisions. It's really, again, this holistic approach to decision making, which is so cool.
It is so cool. And I remember I think it was late last year when we had the opportunity to speak to the leadership team on the West Coast of Whole Foods.
Mm-hmm.
And there was this embodiment of these four tenets in that group of people, unlike anything I'd ever seen, and especially the leaders and the instructors, such as yourself, that I remember just observing outside of patio and exercise where there were paddles or signs that they would hold up to represent these stakeholder areas, and someone would throw out a particular situation, and then it's for each person to embody kind of and own that role of being the environment or whatnot. Well, like, what concerns does it bring up? And it really helped those people think from the lens of how do these moves affect our shareholders, our customers, us as employees, the environment, etc. So I think that there's some really progressive and cool things when you really we take ourselves out of it and we think from the lens of like, how can I really think from that stakeholder group? And that's a great transition to say stakeholder orientation is also like, how do we work closer with our stakeholders in service of our higher purpose?
Mm-hmm.
So what's the bridge that you see there, and how did that show up for you, or does that live for you?
Well, that lived within Whole Foods, that the core values, every single one of the core values that the company has, are based on their stakeholders. So if you actually take a look, a snapshot, go on the website, you'll see examples of we celebrate and honor team member happiness and excellence is one of their core values. So that's one of their stakeholders noted there. They talk about prioritizing the environment and the community, and I won't go through all of them verbatim, but that was a way to really put a stamp or a stake in the ground and say, this is our value set that we will operate from at all points and in all decisions. And also in honoring that sometimes mistakes will be made. They have something called the Declaration of Interdependence, which is really about this growth mindset and this idea that the company is always evolving. We'll keep the core values very close, And sometimes we might make mistakes, and we'll learn from those mistakes and know that, where we are today is helping to dictate where we go in the future, and we will continue to grow and thrive and really try to do the right thing out, in the world. So it's pretty neat. It's so woven into the fabric of the company, and I think it's pretty easy for other businesses to do if you're purpose driven and you take time to really articulate your values and think about the stakeholders. Putting that really as a stake in the ground and on the wall, so to speak, is a way to guide you to continue to live your purpose and really stay present to that at all times.
That's so beautiful. And, with values being such an incredibly important interconnected expression of purpose, right? The rules of conduct, if you will, for how we express our purpose as an organization. It has me think about two things. One of the things that often isn't as shared as much when we talk about stakeholder orientation is that when we look at folks that are already doing this, if you're new to this, we're going to talk about that in a second and give some folks some tools with this solar system approach you have. But if you've been in this game for a while, like what are some of the kind of the next level ideas? Like if you already have mapped out those stakeholders, you're building relationships, you're working towards having those get better in service of both the values of the organization and the higher purpose. Like what are some next level moves, like the real judo that, you might have seen that some folks that are even, old school to the movement would benefit from hearing?
I would say there are ways to build this into your business system. So thinking about strategic and very clear ways to have conversation with your stakeholder groups. So that could be having town halls with your employee or team member base. That can be having invitations of customers from your community come in and actually do roundtables with them. So it's not only about identifying and understanding who the stakeholders are, but start to really integrate them into the conversation. And that, I'd say, is the next level. Maybe that is working with a local environmental group to help them come in and assess what you're doing within your business and are you making green decisions. So there's different levels of partnership there that you can facilitate that will help you live that stakeholder orientation even more than just saying, okay, we understand who our stakeholders are. So really being strategic about how to bring them in to the conversation would be the next level.
That's awesome. Yeah, thank you for that. Those some really cool ideas. And it's a great. You mentioned the Declaration of Interdependence, and in many ways, I've always viewed these four tenets as being interdependent as well, because you can't talk about stakeholder orientation without touching on how it affects culture. If you're going to have a town hall meeting, it's not only a safe space to speak your truth, but it takes courage. It's a brave space that some friends have said recently. It's like, how do you create that environment? And that's where you start to blend this thing of culture with stakeholder orientation, because they all do fit so beautifully together. For those that are new to this idea of stakeholder orientation, that maybe have thought about, I have to keep good relationships with my suppliers, but mostly for survival reasons or competitive advantage or keeping the lowest price or just keeping people happy instead of saying what's possible in that next level. What kind of first moves might you suggest? And then we can kind of, go from there right into how you'd start to map that out based on your experience.
Sure. Well, I would say, if you're first thinking about developing this, one is the process of identifying stakeholders, and those stakeholders might look differently than the ones that we have outlined earlier on the call here. You might have a direct line somehow to government, and thinking through what that relationship looks like. It could be a competitor is actually a stakeholder. If you have a collaborative agreement or sort of relationship with a competitor, then how do you work together to have both of you advance and strip away some of the maybe competitive nature and think, well, shift that to collaboration. How do we both grow and thrive in this situation? And something we haven't mentioned is this idea of win six. So this is not just a win-win relationship, but it's a win-win-win-win-win-win. I think I got all six there. Um, again, understanding, like you said, it's really an integrative approach that each one of those stakeholders is dependent on one another in some way, and thinking through what those relationships are, having some time to really map that out and understand that is going to help you have a clearer path to how you engage with them. So that's what I'd say
That's
as sort of a first step. And I think this is a great tie into this idea of a stakeholder solar system or map that I used to share with entry-level leaders within Whole Foods Market. I share this with the Conscious Capitalism community as well, as a really nice way to tangibly map out what your stakeholder solar system is. And you could do this with any level of employee team member that you have. It's a great way to conceptualize what the sort of ripple effect is for your stakeholders and decisions being made. And I wish we could have a little diagram here, but essentially,
yeah. Let me just jump in with something. It's that it just occurred to me that in addition to going through it with each individual from the lens of the larger organization, that almost every role has its own stakeholder subsystem too, right? So if you're in billing, you have your own stakeholder system of people that are affected by your choices or, dependent or things like that. So it really is, you talked about this idea of competition and, moving to collaboration, or what we've even called, cooperation, right? Someone somewhere said that cool word somewhere. And then another area of stakeholder orientation that we'll often or sometimes bring up, which is in the book, is critics, and how there's a protest outside of Whole Foods, and John went out and spoke with the lead person and learned some things that helped them not only evolve the quality of that particular aspect, not just in the stores, but it affected the entire industry and the entire ecosystem. So sometimes being willing to listen and challenge ourselves to be vulnerable with stakeholders opens huge doors. And without getting into that example, anything to comment on that as far as just really pushing the edges, being out on the skinny branches of stakeholder orientation?
Yeah, well, I think you tapped into it there, Steve. It's really about, in a lot of ways, opening up heart space to receive, give and receive, and have this exchange. That, for a company or a leader, if you're truly being stakeholder oriented, it is having the feedback feed forward. So it's not that we come out and take a stand and know everything as a company, know the way things should be. The sage on the stage is another way to think about it, of we're up in front and we're trying to convince you of what we're doing is the right thing or why we bring value. It's, again, this exchange and this conversation, and being open to the critics or the competitors or what might be initially perceived as opposition, and moving to the same side of the fence with them and think about, how does this shift into a partnership mindset? And we're in this together, trying to, all as humans or as a planet, trying to benefit and grow and really have love and success and safety and belonging. I mean, those are all essential pieces of the human aspect. How do we come to that same side of the fence and have that conversation together in relationship to the business?
Yeah, I love it. And it's that this whole idea of love and care in the workspace that is so throughout the book of Conscious Capitalism, and so at the heart of our movement, because it's at the heart of who we are as human beings. That last year at the conference, Raj said, I believe it was either last year or the year before, the biggest joke is this whole thing, it's not personal, it's just business. That business is personal because we all take so much pride in what we do and who we are. And so when we get away from zero-sum games where someone wins at someone's expense, and that we start thinking about that win six, like you talked about, and really creating, moving into that place of cooperation and creating the bigger space for people to show up, that's when you're going to be blown away by people's, not only their creative capacity, the opportunity for collective genius, the opportunity to create that space where by being vulnerable enough to bring our ideas, that they just get iterated, like you said, with the tap room and guys like that. So what I'd love to do is, before we wrap up the call, is to say, like, do your best to give us a creative visual drawing of like how you might start to look at a stakeholder solar system or ecosystem, if you will, at the big picture. And then, we can also look at, does that apply also for each person in each role? But just when you go to walk people through that, how would you instruct them to start as like a 1.0 on mapping your stakeholder environment?
Absolutely. So I'd say it's as easy as grabbing a blank sheet of paper, or having a whiteboard or a flip chart, whatever your preferred mode is. And if we're looking at a more macro, so the business stakeholder group, you draw a circle in the middle, and that's where the business is. So we'll say Whole Foods Market at the center, just as an entity. Then we think about, in decision making, what's the first level stakeholder that's impacted by those decisions? Now that can shift a little bit based on the decision you're making, right? So if it is has to do with pricing, the first level of stakeholders impacted might be your customers. So you draw that circle on the outside. That's your first orbit. So we think about, okay, so the customers are directly impacted from the decision that we make. Well, outside of that, like, who would be the next level impacted by that particular decision? And you draw another orbit. And in this case, if it's to do with pricing, that would probably be the suppliers or vendors on the next level. Then you continue to draw the concentric circles, and depending on who your stakeholders are, some are going to be directly impacted from that decision, but others maybe in the long run. So if it is about pricing, well, are you trying to reduce cost of something? And in order to do that, are you cutting some corners around carbon footprint or green decisions in order to cut that cost? So on the outside of that large ring could be the environment ultimately being impacted. So that's a way that I like to do it. If you need that tangible sort of visual of your stakeholder solar system, that's a great way to go through that process when you're either in a meeting, making a strategic decision. It's just a good visual for that, and to spend some time thinking about each one of those rings or orbits. Where it comes to individuals, I often did this, as I mentioned, with entry-level Whole Foods Market leaders, is having them draw their own orbit. So putting themselves at the center. If I am a department leader, so I'm in a store, I am running the grocery department, we'll say, for example, a decision that I'm thinking about, who again are going to be the first level of stakeholders that are impacted by the decisions. Well, in that case, a leader's job is really to be the servant leader and the shepherd for their team. So their team members are always going to be the first who are impacted by the decision. And then, so again, you're starting to think that ripple effect or the orbits, well, what's the next level? And there could be some subsets in there that we didn't mention. So, okay, if I'm a leader within a department, my team is affected, my customers are next level affected, and then my entire store. So it might be, team members in other departments are affected by this decision. So that's where you start to think about a more customized version of who the stakeholders are based on your particular solar system. And it's a really great visual to go from sort of tunnel vision, microcosm that a lot of sort of entry-level leaders might be in. They might just be thinking about the inner circle, and they think about, wow, I can impact something greater here, and I need to be conscious and aware of that as I'm making decisions.
That's so cool. Yeah, and just that idea of concentric circles and looking at based on who's the first, who's the second, etc., is often different than the way I've thought about it. And I love, because they're both like, whether you look at it as a solar system, which is a particular lens of those concentric circles, or an ecosystem, which sometimes it's just like, well, let's just identify the stakeholders first. Let's just start drawing circles and say, oh yeah, well, it's our customers and it's our environment and it's our critics. And it's like, where has that shown up? And do you think that that's valuable as kind of a first step to just kind of lay out the map, if you will,
Absolutely.
of like, who are our stakeholders?
Yeah, perfect first step. Really understand who they are and think creatively, because it might not be what's right in front of you. There might be some that you haven't really considered within your ecosystem. So spending the time to do that is incredibly valuable, and it's really that first step to integrating in a way that if you're going to be a conscious business and align with conscious capitalism, you want to spend the time to do that.
That's so cool. Jess, thank you for not only just sharing your wisdom, but just being here to be generous with some ideas and insights that sometimes are more of the more mastery level pieces, those next level moves. And so we'll wrap this call up by just talking a little bit about, if people want to learn more, the first thing would be obviously get the book. The big yellow book is like with a starting point of, the way I often talk about this is like, when I read this, I couldn't unknow it. It just got in my DNA, and everything inside of me said, yes, like I've just been wanting this more than anything else. And I thought I was the only one, or one of few. I was an outlier. And what we're finding is that a conscious approach to business is not only best practice, but that's what's attracting and retaining the best talent. But it's become the new competitive advantage, for leaders, for businesses, because the world is expecting something that's based on a greater good, something that's based on giving back. Mm-hmm. And there's so much to do. And then, of course, just recently, the new launch and announcement of the field guide, which is really what gets more into a, somewhat of a worksheet type situation where you can actually go through, and that's another deep dive. And of course, there's lots of resources. And when you talk about stakeholder orientation, we couldn't do that without giving props to the godfather of this, Ed Freeman, and his work that he did, that there's some incredible videos and resources out there too. So how do you want to bring it home? Anything else you want to be able to share with regard to just where people might think when they think stakeholder orientation as a first blush?
I would say think about how exciting it is to bring this richness into your work and your life, of really pinpointing ways to honor your ecosystem, your solar system. That feels good to do that. And it's also the major differentiator between a conscious business and a traditional business. So this is, while it can feel a little bit nebulous, just identifying and spending the time to think about who your stakeholders are is a beautiful step on that journey to becoming more conscious, to honoring and opening your arms to this collective collaboration, this genius that's available to you as a company or a leader.
Yeah. And once you have this mapped out, then the actions become pretty self-evident, right? The team starts to crowdsource and say, oh, well, here's the first move we could make here and there. And so thank you again for your generosity, for sharing your expertise. And we just appreciate who you are and all that you do for the movement.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.